Welcome to another video, guys. So today we're just doing a bit of a dive on the patch notes. Of course, last night we got the big reveal of Crucible League and all of the content and things that are coming in that patch, and we gained access to the patch notes too. And this video is basically going to be my opinion on the good, the bad, and the ugly of the patch notes. And so yeah, let's get right into it. So starting off with the good here, and number one on the good points, the Crucible League mechanic and the weapon skill trees. I think this looks like a pretty fun League mechanic. I think the interaction with the passive skill tree for weapon types is pretty fun. That's a interesting addition to your character, more ways to kind of specialize into different builds and things like that, because it seems like different weapon types are going to have different trees and different skills associated with it. And Chris talked about how two-handed weapons would have more power level than one-handed weapons, and there's all sorts of different things going on there. So this looks like a fun mechanic in my opinion. I think the league looks pretty fun. As always with me, I'm less interested in the league and more interested in how the core game is going to feel. But of course, if the league is fun and it's interesting, then I think there's always an upside. Next up, we've got Breach and Abyss revamps. These look pretty good. I think anything that brings old League mechanics up to the current level of Path of Exile is always a good thing. And, you know, old Breach interactions and things that people just wouldn't bother going into core Breach stones unless they were farming a particular Breach unique. They would just save up all of the pure ones and run them for XP. And I think that the changes that they're making for different Breach uniques and things like that look really interesting. Instead of doing sort of a really weak version of a unique and then the upgraded version is significantly better, they're now doing something a lot more interesting where the core drop of the Breach unique is actually a completely different item to the upgraded version. So they apply to sort of two different builds. And you could definitely use a lot of the core ones in some builds, and then you would want to get the blessing and upgrade for some different builds. So those look really interesting. The same can be said for Abyss. I think Abyss is going to feel a lot smoother and better to play now. You don't have to bother going into any of these things to try and find a lich. If it opens, it's always a lich. That's pretty nice. And I think just generally farming like Stygian Vies and stuff like that is going to be more straightforward. You don't have to go down into the Abyss anymore. You can just get your Stygian Vies on the ground in the map, so that's a pretty nice change as well. Next up, we've got Atlas Gateways. I haven't got too much to talk about with these. This is just a great addition to the Atlas passive tree. I think as it is right now, the Atlas passive tree is probably the best thing in Path of Exile. It's been one of the greatest additions to the endgame, and it's just improving the Atlas experience, so that's a great addition too. Now we've got the Saboteur and Pathfinder Ascendancy reworks. These are pretty cool. I like the Saboteur one in particular because it's got some kind of interesting things going on. I really like the trigger bots that can play around with, like cast on crit, that sort of stuff. That looks fun. Also, it's got quite an interesting node on the Saboteur, kind of playing around with cooldown. I think GGD need to be a little bit careful with that, because cooldown is always one of those things in games where it's kind of difficult to balance and keep a sort of handle on how much cooldown reduction someone can get and how it can break different mechanics. So that's something to watch out for. Pathfinder is also quite interesting. Not quite as fun, I would say, as Saboteur, but there's definitely some interesting new notables, like the one that gives you like an enduring life flask. That'll open up some new build options. For example, Righteous Fire Pathfinder could be a thing now. I like the change to the Wither node as well, meaning that it works on spells as well as attacks, and that's quite interesting too. Next up, we've got the passive skill tree, new masteries, and new clusters that are being added. These sort of changes always get me interested in the game, because I think any kind of changes to the passive tree is kind of similar to a balance change if it's really, really heavy. And this one, there's quite a few changes here. But overall, I'm not really sure how much this is going to shake up the meta. We will go into a little bit more detail into the meta a little bit later on. But overall, I think new additions to the mastery system and changes to the passive tree are always quite fun and exciting to delve into. So this is a good thing for me. And lastly, in the good section, we've got the new Val skills. I think whenever they add new Val options to the game, it's always interesting. I don't really see a downside to this. It's just more options that people can use. Anybody that was already using those skills now has a new thing to play around with, so this is just all upside for me, and it's always fun to see new Val skills added to the game. And next up, we've got the bad. So we're kicking off the bad with I just wish we would have got more Ascendancy reworks. I know that we got 2 in this patch, but if you stuck around to take a look at the Q&A yesterday with Chris and Ziggy, Chris kind of went into detail about how this patch was supposed to have a lot more Ascendancy reworks in it than eventually got added. And the reason why they didn't do it is because the Ascendancy reworks actually kind of were founded on Ruthless mode. I don't know the exact quote here, but what Chris was trying to say, I believe, is that Ruthless Ascendancies are a bit too powerful, and so they were going to kind of downgrade them a bit, and at the same time they were looking at the stats that they provided, and they wanted to make like more interesting options, and in doing that they kind of went over all of the Ascendancies, but then they realized that, well, the community is probably going to have a bit of backlash to this because it's only happening in Ruthless, so they decided to do it for the whole game. But by the time they kind of got to the crunch of the patch coming out, they didn't really have all of them in a great place. So I think he said about half of all of the Ascendancies were going to be coming in this patch. So I think we can expect a lot of Ascendancy reworks for the next patch. Maybe even all of them, considering it's going to be like the big one that's announced at ExileCon. But I think it's a bit of a shame that we didn't get more, especially considering the reasoning behind it being that, you know, they didn't like the opportunity there for big backlash from the Ruthless mode. So a little bit sad there. Next up, this one's more of just like a pet peeve of mine, but you know, the new Ascendant Pathfinder has the remove bleeding on flask use. That actually got added in this patch, but then the newest version of Pathfinder doesn't even have that stat themselves, so that's kind of a little bit weird. The old Pathfinder had that, the remove bleeding on flask use, but the new one doesn't have it, and for some reason they then added that old stat to the Ascendant Pathfinder. That's a bit weird, so yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there. Next up is just a little bit of a discussion on melee. I think that GGG just doesn't understand melee in their own game. That's the only thing I can really take away from this discussion. During the Q&A, Ziggy once again asked Chris about melee, and Chris basically just started talking about how they've added Vow skills last league, and that's a good enough excuse for melee to be in the place that it is right now. I mean, let's be realistic here. Melee hasn't been in a good place since maybe 3.14, and there's a few like outlier skills that have been carrying Melee in past leagues, like Bone Shatter because it just has this ridiculous amount of flat physical damage, or Lightning Strike because it was, you know, double hitting. I mean, you can't even call that Melee really, can you? But Melee's in a terrible place, and I just get the impression that they have no idea how bad it actually is, and there's just a bad representation for Melee right now in the game. For example, with Bone Shatter being such a highly played skill, all of the other Melee skills, you know, a lot of the slam skills, a lot of strike skills, they're in a really bad place, so I think that they need to address that. I'm hoping that that's going to be addressed at some point, but to be honest with you, we've been waiting for so long at this point that it seems like that's not going to be happening anytime soon. And what the hell is that? And lastly, in the bad section, we've got GGG still trying to push Link skills. Come on, like let's just be real here. Link skills, they're bad. They've always been bad. The options for them are bad. And can we just get rid of Link skills? Like, they just suck. And finally, we reach the ugly section. Now, there's only one point in the ugly section. It's got a kind of place of its own, and that's the lack of skill balance. This is a really big one for me. Some players may feel completely different about this, but I think the game has been in need of a desperate, proper balance patch for a long time. The meta desperately needs a shake-up. It's been kind of the same for maybe 5 or 6 leagues at this point. It's been the same skills at the top, been overperforming skills, underperforming skills, you name it, most of the stuff has been the same. The only thing we've really got is like the last league with the changes to curses, which made poison really powerful, and suddenly we've got a few like really strong contenders up there, but I can't really see these changes to the clusters on the passive skill tree or masteries being a great big meta shift up. I feel like the same skills are still going to be really powerful. We're still going to see poison right at the top, stuff like poison SRS, bone shatter still going to be at the top, seismic trap, righteous fire, all that stuff is still all going to be overperforming because it was good last league and it's still going to be good this league. They made a few tiny tweaks to things like spark, but it's just not enough. We need a big balance patch, GGG. Please give us that soon. And that's it. The good, the bad, and the ugly for patch 3.21 Crucible League. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Do you think I got some of these right? Do you think I got some of these wrong? Let's have a discussion about it. And yeah, guys, thanks for watching. I'm Dreamcore, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.